2 Death Stars. The first one cost, by the only serious estimate anyone has ever attempted, roughly $852 quadrillion just for the steel. That calculation comes from economics students at Lehigh University, published on their Centives blog in February 2012. Steel only. No labor, no weapon systems, no propulsion, no electronics. Just the hull. $852 quadrillion, approximately 13,000 times the entire annual economic output of Earth. In 2013, a citizen's petition asked the Obama White House to begin constructing a Death Star by 2016. Paul Shawcross of the Office of Science and Technology Policy replied formally. He cited that Lehigh figure directly. The construction of the Death Star has been estimated to cost more than $850 million. We're working hard to reduce the deficit, not expand it. That was one station's hull. Zachary Feinstein, a systems engineering professor at Washington University in St. Louis, published a full system model in 2015. Everything included, not just steel. His estimate for Death Star 1, $193 quintillion. Death Star 2, bigger and built in secret while the First War was still ongoing, $419 quintillion. Combined program, roughly $612 quintillion. Then there's the fleet. Imperial Star Destroyers ran 1,600 meters long, massed 40 million tons, and were described by Wookieepedia as one of the most resource-intensive ships in the Imperial Navy. The West End Games sourcebooks, the most detailed numbers anyone has produced, drawn from Legends-era material, put crew complement at around 37,000 per ship, and the total Imperial fleet at roughly 25,000 of these vessels. Disney's canon hasn't confirmed or replaced that number. A single U.S. carrier strike group costs between $2 and $4 billion per year to operate. If an Imperial Star Destroyer ran at even that rate, conservative, given the crew is roughly 4 times larger, 25,000 Star Destroyers represent something in the range of $50 to $100 trillion annually. In operating costs, every year, forever. The Death Star was a capital expense. The fleet is the mortgage that never ends. Armies on top of that. The Wookieepedia entry on the Imperial Navy describes it as millions of warships, fighters, and transports, manned by trillions of officers and enlisted personnel. No primary source gives a total stormtrooper headcount. Any number floating around is fan extrapolation. But even conservative estimates put ground forces in the hundreds of millions. Operations and maintenance is historically the largest single budget item in any military, though personnel runs a massive second. The hardware is almost the easier problem. So who paid for all of it? The obvious answer, they taxed a galaxy. Disney canon reference books put the total number of inhabited worlds at approximately 3.2 million, with around 1.3 million having been member worlds of the Republic at its height. Feinstein modeled the gross galactic product by working backwards from the Death Star's cost, using the Manhattan Project's 0.21% share of US GDP as an analogy, and derived a figure of $4.6 sextillion per year. At that scale, the Death Star program isn't financially impossible. It's achievable. Apply a wartime tax rate. The US spent over 35% of GDP on defense at the peak of World War II, and you can fund almost anything. The math fits, on paper. The problem isn't whether the numbers work in theory. The problem is how the empire actually made them work in practice. And for that, you need to look at what was actually happening on the ground, which is where the galactic taxation story collapses. Real empires that overspent on their militaries left a specific trail. Rome's denarius began as a coin of approximately 95 to 98% pure silver in the Republican era. Nero started the first systematic debasement around 64 CE, cutting it to about 90%. Septimius Severus brought it to 40 to 50% around 200 CE.
By the reign of Claudius II in 268 to 270 CE, the silver content had reached approximately 2%, near base metal. 3 centuries of slow-motion counterfeiting, driven primarily by the cost of paying soldiers, building forts, and fighting on multiple frontiers simultaneously. Rome didn't stop fighting. It stopped being able to afford to fight honestly. Philip II of Spain had a structurally identical problem with different particulars. He controlled the Americas, specifically the silver mines that by the latter half of his reign were delivering enormous shares of crown revenue. More silver than any European monarch had ever held. He defaulted on his debts at least 3 times between 1557 and 1596. The Army of Flanders, the Spanish force fighting the Dutch revolt in the Low Countries, consumed roughly 40 to 60% of Castilian ordinary revenues in peak years. The Armada of 1588 cost, by modern calculations, an enormous fraction of total crown income. Philip's silver couldn't keep pace with his armies. His armies never stopped. 2 real empires, both bankrupted by steel. Neither of them governed anything close to a galaxy. Now look at Kessel. In Solo, a Star Wars story, Kessel appears as an Imperial-controlled site where enslaved workers mine spice and coaxium under conditions the official StarWars.com databank describes as harrowing. That isn't taxation. Taxation involves some form of legal collection, however coerced. Enslaved forced labor extracting resources for off-world shipment is something with a different name. Lothal, in the animated series Rebels, was an agricultural outer rim planet that the Empire converted into an industrial military production hub over the course of the series. Farmland seized, TIE fighter factories installed, locals displaced, resources stripped for Imperial shipbuilding. Lothal isn't governed across those seasons. It's consumed. Andor goes further. Episode 8 depicts Narkina 5, a prison complex where inmates produce standardized military components under electric floor enforcement and threat of summary execution. The Wookieepedia entry on the Galactic Empire states the broader pattern directly. Planets at the edge of the galaxy suffered under Imperial rule, while their resources and wealth were extracted and shipped towards the core. Taxation is a relationship. Extraction is a transaction. A government taxes production and leaves the engine running. It needs the engine to keep running. The Empire was stripping the engine for parts. This distinction matters for one specific reason. A predatory extraction economy has a structural flaw that makes it self-terminating. It has to keep moving. You need resources to fund the military. The military's primary function is enforcing extraction. The more you extract from a world, the less productive that world becomes. So, next period, you need a new source. But your base costs haven't shrunk. They've grown. Because maintaining control of degraded territories requires the same military presence as acquiring new ones, while yielding diminishing returns. The frontier has to keep expanding, or the model implodes from the inside. Rome named this dynamic in practice without ever formalizing it. Julius Caesar's Gallic campaigns from 58 to 50 BCE weren't purely military operations. They were profit centers. Caesar extracted grain, slaves, and annual tribute from Gaul. Ancient sources describe the financial plundering as directly enriching Rome's war machine. The conquest funded the next conquest. When Hadrian, reigning from 117 CE, chose consolidation over expansion and pulled Rome into a defensive posture, the revenues that had come from new conquest stopped. The provinces that had been profit centers became cost centers. Political resistance to taxation increased. The 3rd century crisis, 50 years of civil war, plague, and the currency collapse that produced the 2% denarius, followed. The Mongol Empire ran the same math. Built on tribute and plunder from conquered territories, it held together exactly as long as the conquests continued. When expansion stalled and the empire fragmented into competing khanates, the fiscal model that required centralized conquest simply fell apart. The Galactic Empire, by the time of the original trilogy, had stopped expanding. It controlled the known galaxy. The treadmill had nowhere to run, so it ran faster in place, accelerating extraction from worlds it already held, which degraded those worlds further, which increased the extraction pressure. The rebellion was the symptom of this spiral, not its cause. Then add the final element. Nobody was watching the books. In Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine obtained emergency powers that were never formally revoked. The Senate spent 17 years as a nominal body with no real authority over military spending or resource allocation. In A New Hope, Grand Moff Tarkin announces the dissolution. The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us. I've just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently. The last remnants of the Old Republic have been swept away. His follow-up line, the regional governors now have direct control over their territories. Civilian governance replaced entirely by military command structure. Death Star 1 was constructed in secret through isolated sites and compartmentalized labor. The novel Tarkin establishes this directly. Death Star 2 was built off the books while the rebellion was still ongoing. No Senate, no audit committee, no external accountability at any level. Feinstein's 2015 paper, It's a Trap, Emperor Palpatine's Poison Pill, modeled the consequence. Destroying both Death Stars without a managed bailout of 15 to 20% of gross galactic product risked an overnight economic contraction larger than the U.S. Great Depression at its worst. Palpatine had engineered a financial system with no circuit breakers and no one authorized to pull them. Then came Endor. The Emperor died. The Death Star 2 was destroyed. And the Empire didn't retrench, appoint a successor, and fight back. It shattered. The Battle of Jakku, the final major engagement, roughly a year after Endor, ended in formal surrender. The Aftermath trilogy depicts immediate fragmentation into warlordism, with regional governors declaring independence and imperial commanders seizing whatever assets remained in their sectors. By the time of The Mandalorian, 5 years after Jakku, imperial remnants are fractured, desperate, and resource-starved. What was, by any measure, the most powerful military force in fictional history had gone from galaxy-spanning empire to scattered warlords in about 12 months. A government with a real economy survives leadership transitions. Philip II's Spain defaulted repeatedly and kept functioning for another century. Rome debased its currency for 300 years before the Western Empire actually fell. Real states have civilian infrastructure, tax collection mechanisms, accumulated reserves, and economic relationships that outlast individual leaders. Alexander the Great's empire is the closer parallel, a conquest-dependent machine held together by one conqueror's momentum, which fragmented immediately after his death in 323 BCE. Wars of succession began within weeks. His generals divided the spoils and spent 40 years killing each other over the pieces. The empire's warlord period started before Endor's fires had gone cold. A government with a real economy underneath it doesn't evaporate when the leader dies. It transitions. The empire skipped the transition entirely. It dissolved, because the economy was never underneath the armor. It was the armor. Strip mining the galaxy, world by world, to pay for the steel to strip mine the next world. The empire didn't have an economy. It had an appetite. Every world it took paid for the next one it would take, and the steel kept piling up. 2 Death Stars, tens of thousands of Star Destroyers, armies too large to count, balanced on a galaxy being quietly devoured to keep the lights on. A machine like that can't stop. It can only conquer until it runs out of galaxy or runs out of emperor. At Endor, it ran out of emperor. And the reason the most powerful regime in the history of the stars didn't decline, but simply vanished, is the simplest reason there is. When you finally looked under the armor, there was never anything holding it up but the man with the gun. They took the gun away. There was no second page to the ledger. Subscribe if you want more stories like this.